This is the all-new BMW 2 Series. Updated for a brand new generation, this car aims to take the incredibly popular 2 Series Gran Coupe to a brand new generation of buyers. The question now is, can this car keep up in a faster-paced, very different world from the one that it was first introduced into? Now, one of the best parts of the new 2 Series to me is actually the way this car looks. The previous generation looked slightly dumpy with kind of very strange proportions, like a BMW body being stretched over a front-wheel drive powertrain that it was never really meant to manage, which it was. Whereas this one now looks a little bit more deliberate, looks more intentional, and as a result, to me, it looks a lot better. So for example, up front, we now have a much wider, much more prominent kidney grille, which even comes with fluting around the center bits in order to make this look a little bit more prominent, and it's even surrounded by lots of brushed aluminium, which makes it look very good indeed. Flanking that are a set of full LED headlights replete with LED indicators, and on top of that, these lights also appear to come with active matrix LED high beams, which is something that I've only seen a couple of times, and I'm pretty sure it's there, although BMW won't give me a straight answer. Now, it is worth noting that the BMW 218 that we received in Malaysia comes in a Sport line trim, not an M Sport, which is why up front you get a slightly more aggressive front end, but not quite as aggressive as what you'd get from an eventual M Sport model, which I'm sure will be introduced to Malaysia in due course. Now, in terms of rolling stock, this car rides on 18-inch alloy wheels wrapped in Goodyear Eagle F1 asymmetrical tires. The design of these wheels, I think, are a bit of a highlight because despite the fact that they are not very large, they fill up the arches really quite well, and I think that the design is complex enough that it certainly adds a little bit more of visual interest to the profile of the car. And to me, it is ultimately this profile that I think what sells the 2 Series most of all. Because compared to the Mercedes-Benz A-Class saloon, which looks like a much more traditional 3-box saloon, this car looks a lot more rakish, a lot more sporty, and as a result, it looks a lot more dynamic and a lot more interesting to customers. Now, because the 2 Series is built as a coupe, that's why it enjoys frameless windows, which is why it looks this good. And of course, when it's down, it looks even better still. But because this is not an M Sport model, that's why we get chrome trim accenting the window line itself with a nice embossed 2 back here to accentuate the Hofmeister kink. Now, of course, if this was an M Sport model, you could probably get this in shadow line trim where this would be all done up in black. But as far as I'm concerned, I do think that the chrome really does help to set off the side profile of this car quite well. And because of these rear quarter lights, this not only improves the amount of light that gets into the cabin, but it also improves visibility when you're looking over your shoulder, like when you're reversing out of a parking space, for example. So this is quite successful. Now, one of the things about this car that I'm not a big fan of is the fact that this silver trim that I mentioned earlier is not done to quite the same quality as what you'd expect from, say, a BMW 3 Series, for example. Because this chrome trim, while it might look like a singular piece from the front all the way to the rear, there's this hideous join line right here, and it's very small, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I feel that if I were to have bought one of these, this is one of those things that would irritate the hell out of me. Now, while we're at this angle, I'd also like to point out this car's size. Now, in terms of dimensions, the new 2 Series hasn't grown that much over the outgoing model, but the wheelbase has been lengthened ever so slightly in order to improve interior space, which we'll get onto a little bit later. But overall, I do think that this is one of the more successful angles of the new 2 Series, and I do think that it retains that Gran Coupe styling that it has to, while not looking outwardly dumpy or compromising interior space like the Mercedes-Benz CLA. Now, at the rear of the 2 Series, I love the way the sloping roofline gently ends, it tapers downwards and ends in this nice sort of ducktail spoiler, which I think really does help to make the back end look a little bit more dynamic, and it really does help that side profile a little bit. But I also appreciate the fact that now these tail lights are a little bit more tapered and they bleed into the tailgate in order to emphasize the width of this car. Now, these lights themselves are actually quite intelligent in and of themselves because they actually do a little bit of an animation when you lock and unlock the car, which I think makes this car look and feel a little bit more upmarket, a little bit more special. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the 2 Series is now dubbed the 218, not the 218i. And of course, this is not an M Sport model, which is why we don't get an M Sport bumper down here. I've no doubt that if this was an M Sport car, there would be a lot more of this contrasting plastic coming up here in order to reduce the visual bulk. What I do find quite interesting is the fact that this car doesn't have exposed tailpipes at all, not even exhaust exits or even a shroud. Instead, they're all pointed downward and hidden neatly underneath the rear bumper. But one of the most successful parts of the new 2 Series to me is actually this tailgate, because in addition to there being a kick to open hands-free function, what I appreciate is the fact that the design of this tailgate is now a lot more practical than before, if I can actually find the release. In addition to it being spring-loaded, so it pops open quite easily with just the push of a button, what I appreciate is the fact that this floor is almost completely flat. As you can see, there is only a very small ridge here, which means that even when you're rolling things in and out, it's really not all that difficult. Which means that if you are loading stuff in here, it's going to be a little bit easier than it was before. In addition to that, even though this car is not that big, this boot is relatively deep, which means that even if you have 4 people worth of luggage in here, for example, they can each have a carry-on suitcase without any issue whatsoever. And as if that wasn't enough, you also have access to some hooks, a little bit of a netted area down here, and there's even a little bit of underfloor storage for smaller items if you want those to be hidden away. And of course, this floor can also be lowered in order to increase the vertical space in here. And of course, if that is still not enough, you can also fold the rear seats 40-20-40 should you be moving house or buying furniture. All of this built into a relatively small and also the most affordable BMW that money can currently buy. That, I think, is really smart. But honestly, I think it's this interior where the 2 Series really makes that generational leap into an all-new model, because a lot of the things in here now look and feel very similar to more upmarket, larger BMW models. For example, this infotainment and digital instrument cluster setup now sits in that same curved display that we've seen from other BMW models, with this very large screen here with great graphics and the very latest operating system from BMW operating all of this, and so it looks and feels really posh. However, what does let the side down is this digital instrument cluster, because as you can see, while the height of this panel is sort of this tall, this screen is only about that tall, which means that you have all this space up here doing absolutely nothing, which in addition to looking a little bit funny, it also serves to remind you that perhaps there was a higher grade model that we didn't get in this country. Now, what irritates me slightly is the fact this infotainment system, although now very good, also integrates the HVAC controls. Although that perhaps maybe isn't so bad, because at least you can control your temperature just from this panel down here, which never disappears even if you have Apple CarPlay or Android Auto running. What is slightly annoying, however, is the fact that to manipulate this display, you no longer have an iDrive controller, not even a small one down here. Instead, this panel now just controls things like your gear selector, as well as your rear defoggers, your drive modes, as well as your vehicle settings, as well as a small rocker for your volume knob. Aside from that, there's nothing else here, which means that if you want to manipulate this on the go, you are going to have to reach for this screen. Now, that wouldn't be so bad if this was the most intuitive system in the world. Unfortunately, if I bring up the app drawer here, as you can see, all of the icons in this car look exactly the same, which means that when you're driving along, you don't have a lot of visual differentiation as to what you're touching or what you're looking for. Which means that ultimately, if you are driving along, you are going to have to avert your gaze down here and actually read the description for each and every one of these tiles in order to manipulate the various settings, which I find incredibly irritating. Now, mercifully, things like Apple CarPlay and Android Auto do come as standard, and they are both wireless, which means that by the time you get in the car, for me at least, my Android Auto has already loaded, my music's already playing, and so is my Waze, which means that getting about and moving about and so on is really not all that difficult, and usually my temperature is already set based on my profile. However, if you were to want to get a little bit more into or in depth into some of these modes, for example, that's when things get really difficult, because once again, you can't really do anything from here. all of these settings have to be manipulated within the screen, which means that, again, when you're here, for example, if I was in personal and I suddenly want to go to efficient, I have to press my modes and then press efficient and then wait for this screen to disappear before it eventually goes back to my Android Auto. And so during which time I certainly hope I haven't missed a junction, for example. And worst of all, within these modes, there are a whole bunch of things that don't seem to make sense. So there is efficient and sport, that's self-explanatory. There is personal, which for whatever reason doesn't really allow me to personalize much. Instead, if I go to sport, for example, suddenly here I can control my drivetrain, driving dynamics, and steering weight. Why? Shouldn't this have been in personal instead? And then it gets even worse, because if I were to scroll beyond this, there are also modes such as expressive, relax, digital art, and silent, which as far as I can tell do absolutely nothing to the drive mode. It just does some stuff to the background wallpaper. Why? Now, beyond this system, which is whatever, you do at least get a nice chunky BMW steering wheel, which is nicely weighted, leather wrapped, nicely stitched. And of course, you do get physical buttons on this steering wheel, which are, again, a bit of a hit and miss. On the right side, that controls things like your digital instrument cluster information and stuff like that. That works well enough. The left side controls things like your speed limiter or your cruise control. Unfortunately, this car does not come with active cruise control, which means that at least this time you will be spared from hearing about me moan about adjusting the distance within this screen. Now, beyond that, as you can see, the air conditioning vents in this car have been minimized because they're all just little slits now, the control of which mercifully is not digital. They are run by these little rubber nubs that live down here. Now, I know that some of you may prefer the big air conditioning vents with the control in them. I agree, compared to digital controls, those are much better. But I think that for cars that are looking for the slightly more minimalist design, I think this might be the better solution, because at least you don't have to have a whacking great vent in front of you, but more importantly, you still enjoy the tactility of being able to adjust the vents when you need to, how you want to, which is always nice to see. Now, as we move further down, there's a little shelf here, which is great to hide your sunglasses, which is fantastic because there's no case up here. There's a wireless charging pad, a couple of cup holders, a 12-volt socket, 2 USB-C ports, and a relatively small center console bin, which in addition to being quite small is also quite shallow, which means that the number of things you can hide in here are quite limited. Mercifully, however, the glove box, if I can find the button, is of a decent enough size, and you do get door bins large enough for a liter-sized bottle with space behind that for smaller items like a wallet, for example, which is exactly how I've been using this car. Now, in terms of ergonomics, everything falls relatively easily to hand. Everything is exactly where you expect to be. There are still stalks behind the steering wheel, thank God, although there are no paddle shifters. But in terms of adjusting the steering wheel, you have plenty of adjustment, both up and down as well, to bring it fore and aft. And of course, these seats are also electrically adjustable with adjustable lower thigh support, which is nice, plus 2-stage memory should you be sharing your BMW 2 Series with someone else. The only trouble I have is, again, for north of 200,000 ringgit, for whatever reason, this car doesn't come with lumbar support. Now, in the back of the 2 Series Gran Coupe, as I mentioned, the wheelbase of this car has been lengthened slightly in order to improve rear seat legroom. And so with the front seats that are in my driving position, about 170 centimeters, as you can see, I have a good amount of knee room and a pretty decent amount of headroom, given the fact that this is ultimately a compact car. Now, although it might appear that I don't have that much in terms of under-thigh support, because I don't, at least I can tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me, which does make me feel a little bit more comfortable. Now, although this car is also set as a 5-seater, please, for the love of God, do not put anyone in this central seat, because in addition to there being a transmission tunnel, this seat itself is also not very wide. So unless you have a friend with an arse that's about that big, just don't. Now, if you don't, or rather if you're not set on torturing a central passenger, you do have a nice center armrest here with a couple of cup holders, which is of a very nice angle as far as I'm concerned. And you do have a couple of crotch coolers all the way down there, which, if as far as I can tell, can be angled toward your face, assuming that it can pass your knees. There are also a couple of USB-C ports to charge up regular devices. Now, one of the things about the back end of this car that I find a bit curious is the fact that there doesn't seem to be much by the way of practicality. You've got door bins here, which are big enough for maybe 500, 750 milliliter bottles, and of course, there's a little bit more of space sort of behind that. But there's no net behind the front seats or even a pocket of some kind, which I find a bit weird. But at least in terms of practicality for car seats, this car does seem to accommodate, because there are ISOFIX mounts on the two outer rear seats, and there's also an ISOFIX mount on the front seat, which means that, for example, if you're a young family, there can be one spouse in the front seat, one spouse in the rear, and then you can have the child seat in the front in order to maximize legroom, because a rear-facing child seat will be a bit of a challenge in this car because the doors themselves are not very large, and of course these back seats do recline to a certain degree, which means that it is very possible for a bulky rear-facing child seat to end up pushing up against the backs of the front seats. Now, as far as I'm concerned, everything in here, everything I've just told you, should not come as a surprise to anyone looking at a BMW 2 Series anyway. This car has never really traded on space. Instead, it's traded on the fact that you are getting the BMW recipe made smaller. So now, back to the front seat to figure out if that reigns true. Now, the world has changed a lot since the BMW 2 Series first debuted. Let's not forget that the 2 Series was a family of vehicles, which included a high-riding MPV type thing that would have rivaled the Mercedes-Benz B-Class, and it also came as a Grand Tourer, where you had a third row of seats. However, both of those body styles have since fallen out of favor, leaving just this, which is the 2 Series Gran Coupe. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you may have noticed that this car is no longer referred to as the 218i. Instead, it's just referred to as the 218. The reason being, fuel injection is now commonplace. But I'm told that there are supposed to be some updates to BMW's naming conventions, which is why this is going to be the first model simply referred to as the 218. Now, under the bonnet, you will find a very familiar 1.5-litre turbocharged engine producing about 150 odd PS and a little bit about 230 Newton meters of torque, if I'm not mistaken, with that power going to the front wheels via a 7-speed dual-clutch automatic gearbox. This is essentially the same setup that we saw from this car in the previous generation, and so that hasn't been fiddled with at all. However, one of the accusations that we have leveled at the BMW 2 Series time and time again is the fact that it being a front-wheel drive platform and also having a very different platform overall, very different dynamics compared to the rest of the BMW lineup, does this car still feel like a genuine BMW? Now, from the interior, from the moment you get inside, it certainly feels like a very BMW-like experience. You have the dual digital screens up ahead of you, nestled in this curved facade, which is very reminiscent of other modern BMWs that money can buy today. Of course, this being the 218 and also currently the most affordable BMW that money can buy, the digital instrument cluster for the driver is notably smaller than not only the infotainment system to the left, but also from other BMW models. However, the steering wheel does feel very similar to other BMW models, which means that once again you have this very familiar grip, this very familiar feel, and all of the buttons and switchgear that are set about it also feel very familiar in that regard. And so in terms of BMW-ness, the 2 Series already lands on a pretty good foot. However, while these seats are very supportive and provide excellent lateral support, as any good BMW should, given the fact that these are designed to be corner carvers in the first place, unfortunately, from the moment you put your foot down, you do feel a slight difference in the way this car takes off and the way this car handles itself. For example, you can feel the fact that the power is pulling you away from the standstill rather than pushing you out of it, which is a notable difference because, of course, every other BMW is rear-wheel drive. In addition to that, that also means that when you are heavy on the throttle, especially at standstill or in conditions where you might be challenging the grip, you will feel the steering wheel start to squirrel away, because obviously these front wheels are doing more than just transmitting power, they are also in charge of deciding your direction of travel. But once you get past those relatively small things, because honestly you're only going to be noticing these things if you're really paying attention to it, the recipe in here does feel decidedly BMW. For example, the little things such as the sound of the indicators, the smell of the upholstery, and of course the way the engine chimes in under heavy throttle does feel reassuringly BMW. Now, talking about that engine, of course this is only a 3-cylinder, not a 6, as some of the most iconic BMWs have been, but at least it has a nice thrum to it, making it feel a little bit more distinctive and a little bit less generic compared to other vehicles within this segment. And of course, it takes off with a certain alacrity that the Mercedes-Benz A-Class saloon simply cannot match. That car has a very lazy powertrain at best, with a sloppy gearbox and a relatively laggard-feeling engine, whereas this feels a lot more attentive, even when you're not driving it in sport mode. And then, of course, there comes the ride and handling. Now, BMWs have enjoyed particularly dynamically focused rides, shall we say, which means that these cars have always erred on the side of firm rather than comfortable. But of course, because BMW has been in the car making business for 600,000 years, it also means that their engineers have a certain ability to tune these engines and tune the suspension setup in such a way that it delivers a very positive experience. And so while the engine certainly works very well, the suspension setup, I think, has been vastly improved over the outgoing 2 Series. For example, this car no longer feels crashy on difficult surfaces. Instead, it sort of rounds off the edges of very bad surface imperfections, leading to a much more confident, much more stable, far less jittery ride within the cabin. And of course, when speeds pick up and you take on these larger diameter corners like I am now, this car no longer leans or fidgets anymore, despite that slightly softer secondary ride, which means that to me, this certainly feels like much more of a BMW. And for those of you wondering about the legitimacy of my commentary on this, I've not had one BMW previously, I've had 3. And in fact, I still have one because they just drive like nothing else. And that is something that appeals to me as someone who believes himself to be at least driver focused and something of an enthusiast. Now, the benefit of this improved suspension is not only for when you're cruising along or taking on back roads and driving enthusiastically, but also for when you're just trying to cover distance. Because the previous generation 2 Series generally felt like it was far too fidgety to be any real use over a long distance journey. Because the car was constantly fidgeting, you would find yourself constantly having to adjust to the car and whatever it was that the car was doing at the time, which meant that covering distance was honestly rather tiring affair. Whereas in this, because of this much more supple suspension setup, it does feel like you can do meaningful distance without feeling overly tired or feeling overly taxed, which is always nice to see, particularly when you're spending a little bit over 200,000 ringgit. However, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this monologue, the problem with the 2 Series now is not the 2 Series itself, but the world within which it exists. When this car first came out, there was a fervor for mini luxury cars, highly compact vehicles designed primarily for the road, but still have that feel and the overall sense of premiumness, not just in terms of the experience, but also in terms of the engineering, the dynamics that you would get from a premium brand just in a smaller package. Perhaps in response to rising car prices or the fact that our city centers are getting more and more busy, there was a clear demand for luxury cars made smaller. However, this is 2025. We no longer see 218,000 ringgit as a way to get into an affordable BMW. Instead, we see this as a way to get into the top-end models in much more affordable brands. For example, this amount of money could get you into a JQ J8 or an Omoda C9. It could get you into a Mazda CX-8 or, in fact, the hitherto unlaunched Mazda CX-60, all of which are cars from brands that may exist a tier or half a tier lower in the social ladder, but seem to have that same aim for poise and premium comfort from behind the wheel and also from the rest of the cabin. Which then begs the question, do cars like this still need to exist? And more importantly, do they still convincingly provide that premium ownership and driver experience that people are so desperately wanting? Now, jumping back behind the wheel, yes, we've already touched on dynamics, but of course there is also the matter of refinement. Now, the BMW lineup toward the bottom end of the range has never really performed that impressively in this regard. In fact, I have chided many a BMW 3 Series for being a little bit too loud, a little bit too boomy, a little bit too drony, especially when you're driving at speed, and unfortunately this BMW 2 Series is a bit of a mixed bag. Now, Now I'm doing about 110 kilometers an hour on what I could only describe as a road with a rather awful surface, and I've no doubt you can hear that there is a pretty decent amount of road noise. Now the tires on this car are of a softer compound, which means that these should be pretty good at soaking up noise and reducing decibel levels within the cabin, but it seems to me that this car is very road surface dependent, because when driven on the elite motorway, for example, or in fact on the North-South Highway, this car does seem to quieten down rather convincingly. But of course, when you do run on patches like this, where it's a bit coarser, then at that point you will hear a little bit more noise intrude into the cabin. Now, in terms of wind noise, things are a little bit better. The reprofiled wing mirrors, for example, really do help in terms of reducing the amount of wind noise produced by the A-pillar. But of course, because this car has frameless windows, it does mean that there is a little bit of wind noise intrusion from the B-pillar, sort of just behind my right ear. But of course, this only becomes really irritating when you wander past the national speed limit significantly. But when you're just driving sort of at 110, 120 kilometers an hour, this isn't really a problem at all. And as far as I'm concerned, the only thing that's really bugging me right now is the fact that this car doesn't offer lumbar support, even for the driver, but also the lack of active safety features. Now, the BMW 218 is not completely bereft of ADAS. You do get things like rear cross traffic alert, a reverse camera, blind spot monitoring with warning and steering prevention, as well as lane departure alert. These are all very good things, and the lane departure alert, for example, can be very helpful when you're traveling over longer distances where you might get tired over a certain period, for example. However, the fact that this car is a little bit north of 200,000 ringgit and doesn't offer things like adaptive cruise control with traffic jam assist, a 360-degree camera, for example, those are things that really start to bite and gnaw at you, because yes, this does feel like a premium car. This does feel like a luxury car in everything that it does. The weighting of the steering wheel, the way the controls operate, even the sound of things in this car, like the buttons and the switches and the pedals, all of that does feed into this premium experience, but I still have to drive myself through traffic. Now, BMW does appear to be paying attention, because they have updated their 3 Series lineup to now offer things like adaptive cruise control with traffic jam assist, which is great because the average 3 Series buyer spends a lot of their time in town, which means that they are going to inevitably find themselves in traffic. However, the 2 Series customer is also just as likely to find themselves in traffic, which means that things like traffic jam assist and adaptive cruise control suddenly become much more important. And so the lack of it at this price point becomes a lot more noted and a lot more noteworthy. So the 2 Series is a good car, yes. If you're looking for a premium ownership experience and you're looking for a premium car experience, and I think the 2 Series does seem to deliver that quite convincingly, the way that the powertrain works with this gearbox, the way the suspension has been tuned to provide a sharper edge while not losing that suppleness that you need in order to meaningfully cover distance, and more importantly, for me at least, the natural weighting of the steering in this car, which feels like it is truly connected to those front wheels in a way that a lot of these newcomer challenger brands can't quite nail down yet. All of this feeds into an experience which for me screams premium. This is a luxury car, and so there is no question to me that the BMW 2 Series in this generation still delivers a premium experience. However, if you're looking to spend 200 grand on something a little bit bigger that could accommodate a family, for example, if you're slightly more concerned about boot space and that sort of practicality, etc., then of course there is the BMW X1, which comes in at around about the same price, and naturally being an SUV, or according to BMW, a sports activity vehicle, offers a little bit more space for people and flotsam, which means that, again, that should be a slightly more premium experience. It should be slightly more accommodating for family buyers. However, if you want something that seems to deliver better bang for buck, if what you're looking for is something to win a game of top trumps, then the BMW 2 Series might not be it. And so you might be better served by something like a Jayco J8 or an Modus C9, both of which can be had for about 200,000 ringgit and offer more in terms of performance, practicality, etc. However, if you are leveling the BMW 2 Series against its sole direct competitor, which is the Mercedes-Benz A-Class Saloon, then I can tell you that the 2 Series drives with better poise, and it seems to have the dynamics better down pat compared to the A-Class Mercedes. On top of that, this interior is built to a slightly better quality, which means that again, it feeds into that premium experience. And more importantly, this powertrain feels a lot more polished than what you get from the A200 and A250, which means that again, once again, the BMW 2 Series is showing up its competitors without breaking a sweat. And all for about 218,000 ringgit. In any case, that concludes our review of the latest generation BMW 218 Sport Gran Coupe. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to be notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and TikTok. All the links are in the description below, including the link to join our new WhatsApp channel so that you are always up to date on the very latest news happening within the Malaysian motoring industry. Thank you so much for watching. We will catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe and jangan bodoh.